to the Woodrow Wilson Center this hot afternoon. We appreciate all of you who braved the weather here in D.C. to come join us for a discussion of a critical topic, urbanization and unleashing the potential of urban growth, a discussion of the State of the World's Population Report. I think it's the 30th anniversary, actually, of UNFPA publishing this report, one that many of us are looking forward to seeing every year because it's usually, well, not usually, it's always so rich in detail and resource, but also picking critical themes to help us understand how these issues come together. And those of you who are familiar with the Wilson Center will understand that this approach that UNFPA takes of bringing together critical issues in linkage is exactly what we're trying to do here. The Environmental Change and Security Program is a 13-year-old program that tries to facilitate discussion and dialogue between the practitioners and the scholars on issues as diverse as health, population, development, environment, along with broader foreign policy and security policy issues, economic policy issues. And so very much the theme and the integration that this report achieves in trying to understand urbanization, its connection to all these issues, is something right up our alley and that we applaud and therefore try to really facilitate discussion and lively debate on it with folks like yourselves. And I should also mention through a live webcast and archive video, folks online as well. We're very fortunate to have George Martine here to present the report. It was launched this morning at the Press Club. George is someone who I finally now today am meeting. He has contributed to our reports over the years, I think 8 or 9 years ago initially, and we have some of those older reports out there. His expertise then on natural disasters and population and migration and how to structure, including urban areas, how to plan for these and really mitigate some of those impacts. So it's terrific that he's coming to join us today. He's president of the Brazilian Association for Population Studies and scientific director for the Paris-based Population Development Environment Research Project, and as in this case, a consultant to UNFPA. So it's terrific that he's able to join us and present the report today. We've asked Tony Kolb, who has a somewhat shorter commute here in the building from USAID's. Well, you're sitting in a lot of places, but as an urban health advisor, it's hard to categorize Tony in terms of one place within aid, because what he's trying to do as that urban health advisor is really work with the different missions and the country teams to bring these issues to the fore and have that be an integral part of the AID's approach on the ground. So it's terrific that Tony can come and share his insights with us. He's someone who we've known at the center for a long time, in part because he was one of in fact, the only person who could meet the criteria for a very challenging population and environment posting in Tashkent with Médecins Sans Frontières on TB and have a PhD and all sorts of other things. So he really is multidimensional, and it's terrific that we have him coming here to the center to share a conversation with us today. Just a couple things I should mention. For starters, here at the Wilson Center, we have a number of different programs and projects. So today's program is co-sponsored by the Environmental Change and Security Program, the Global Health Initiative, and also our Comparative Urban Studies program. And so it's terrific that all three of us can be collaborating on that. I should say, as in many cases, we are very appreciative for the support of USAID's Office of Population and Reproductive Health that makes series meetings like this possible. And so it's terrific to see some of you folks here in the room. And then also, and I promise this will be, at least for me, the only downer note of the meeting, all of us who are chairing meetings here at the Wilson Center these days want to call to your attention the fact that one of our colleagues, our Middle East Program Director, Hala Esfandiari, is in prison in Iran, Tehran, charged by the regime with trying to overthrow that government. And it's a matter of obvious tremendous concern for us. And in fact, there was a rally in UN Plaza today for her and the other Iranian-American detainees. And so I want to just make sure all of you are aware of that. I think we have some information out front. Obviously, we're trying everything we can to get her out of solitary confinement. If you have any ideas, they're most welcome, but we want to make sure you all know about that. So I'm going to turn the floor over to George to start us off with the presentation. We'll turn it to Tony and then have a lively discussion with all of you. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I really appreciate the kind words. I also want to thank Gib Clark for having initially sparked this meeting here. We met in another meeting in Paris a few months ago, and and thought that would be an interesting opportunity to discuss this on a more academic level. I'm going to fall right into it, and I appreciate all of you coming here. Like the airlines say, I know you have a lot of other opportunities for the use of your time, so thank you for coming, and I'll be as quick as possible. I'm going to focus. The report is pretty long and has a lot of detail on a lot of things. I'm going to focus on one aspect which I think summarizes best where we are trying to go with the UNFPA publication. We feel that there are several misconceptions that orient public policy in the area of urbanization and urban growth, and I want to deal with some of these with you today. First of all, some of the background, the demographic profile. What are we talking about? Why is global urbanization important? Well, one thing is that half of the world population is supposed to be urban in 2008. That is obviously a very important landmark, and it's symbolic, and also an opportunity for us to reflect on what is going on. What is going on is that we're having an increase of 1.2 million urbanites a week. That's a lot of people. It involved a move from current 3.3 billion people to almost 5 billion by the year 2030. And at the global level, all future urban growth, all future population growth will be urban. That is to say, from now until the year 2030, it's projected that there will be actually a decrease in the world's rural population of about 30 million people, while there is an increase of 1.7 billion urbanites. Most of this new urban growth will occur in developing countries, particularly in Africa and Asia, where the urban population will be doubled in a 30-year time span. That is to say, I can't emphasize how mind-boggling this is, that from the beginning of history until this day, we have X number of urbanites, and this is going to double in only in less than a generation. In short, the background is that massive urban growth is imminent, and that will be good or bad depending on how it is approached and what we do with it. Just a rough idea of the scale and the location of urban growth by world regions. These represent 20-year spans. The one on your left, you may not see it very clearly, but it's from 1950 to 1970, and the last one on the right is from 2010 to 2030. The bright orange line that you see is urban growth in Asia, and the blue line or purple line right next to it is Africa. You can see that this is where really it's going to happen. Anything, the other regions, including Latin America, where the urban transition is well advanced, are relatively insignificant by comparison in terms of urban growth. So 80% of all urban growth in those two regions, Asia and Africa. What is the purpose in the UNFPA report? I think we're trying to do basically these things. First of all, challenge some of the more common misconceptions about how urbanization occurs and what its meaning is. Contest some of the what we think are incorrect policies that are being utilized with respect to this issue. Suggest a few better approaches, and suggest some ideas on how we could help carry them out. What I'm going to talk about is 7 common misconceptions. It's a nice Kabbalistic number. We could make it 10, we could make it, but this probably summarizes the main misconceptions. And the biggest one, the generic one, is obviously that urbanization is inherently bad. This is pretty common, has been common particularly in the environmental community, and it's increasingly common amongst policymakers, particularly in those countries which are undergoing rapid urban growth. Another misconception is that most urban growth occurs in megacities. I will deal with each one of these in my presentation. Urban growth comes mainly from migration to cities, and that therefore rural to urban migration can and should be stopped. A misconception in terms of what the composition of urban growth is in terms of socioeconomic conditions. The poor actually, are they a marginal minority in cities? One complaint that is often leveled at the city is that they occupy a huge amount of land area, and that as a whole urbanization inevitably harms the environment. Look at it this way, is urbanization really bad? We think that and in reality, cities provide great potential for social development, for economic growth, and even for demographic improvement, and also for environmental issues. A key question that you have to ask in this context is, would anything really improve if the population were more dispersed over the territory? If you take the population of this country or any other country, or the population of the Earth, which is now about 6.7 billion people, if you disperse that throughout the world, would there be any advantage to that? And basically my answer is no. And so the question I think that has to be asked is, why are cities not taking full advantage of their potential? And the answer is basically because of poor governance. We feel that urbanization is actually pretty good. From an economic standpoint, cities have always, in recent decades, have an enormous advantage over rural areas. Today, they concentrate maybe to 80 to 90% of GNP growth. And the urban advantages tend to be, if anything, heightened by globalization, because cities in even the poorest countries tend to concentrate those advantages that are of interest to global interests. And so cities are better able to compete on this globalized framework of economic competition. From a social standpoint, there are basically three advantages. Since cities have more resources, they concentrate economic growth, then they have more resources to deal with whatever social problems. So under the understanding that without resources, social policies always need funds, and without resources, there's really not a great deal that you can do. The idea is that, first of all, you have more resources to distribute. You also have enormous advantages of scale and proximity. Concentration and density make it easier to provide social services or services of any kind. You think of education, you think of health, you think of sanitation, you think of water, you think of power, electrical power. Everything is so much easier, much cheaper on a per capita basis in densely concentrated urban areas. Also, a third aspect that we emphasize quite a bit in the report is that cities favor important changes in social organization. Just think about the opportunities for the empowerment of women and youth in cities. Women tend to be freer from traditional restraints and traditional patterns of social organization. They have more opportunities to intermingle, to obtain information, to work in the labor market, and therefore have an independent source of income, which increases their power of negotiation within the domestic unit. They have the ability to interchange information with people who have similar interests. They have been the key in women's organizations and community organizations that have made important changes in cities. In other words, there's a whole series of transformation, and I'm talking only about women's empowerment at this point, but the same thing is true at just about any level. There are more opportunities for social improvement in urban areas. From a demographic standpoint, we know as a fact of life that urban areas always have lower fertility, because there is very little incentive to having a large family in a city, and a lot of disincentives. And moreover, there tend to be better access to reproductive health service, although this is not universally true, because some of the worst slum areas are very poorly served, whether for reproductive health service or anything else. But in general, this holds true. And finally, what may seem counterintuitive, from an environmental standpoint, density and concentration are actually necessary, particularly if you think of the preservation of rural biodiversity. If you spread out the population of this country throughout the entire country, then there will be very little fauna and flora left. There's very little possibility for preservation of rural biodiversity. This is a clear example, for instance, in Brazil, where the invasion of the Amazon by a relatively small number of people caused an enormous and environmental impact. And also cities are basically where technological solutions are generated. They have bigger environmental problems, but the solutions are there as well. A second misconception is that most urban growth occurs in megacities. Megacities are sexier. They've received a lot more attention because they have bigger problems and they have more coverage in the media. But actually, most urban growth occurs in smaller cities, in cities of 500,000 or less people. And this has enormous implications in the current political context, wherein smaller cities and local governments are receiving more the devolution of federal power to the extent that local authority and local transparency are being promoted. So you have most growth in those areas to which power is being devolved. The good news is that it's easier to deal with smaller cities than to deal with growth. There's more room to maneuver if you think in terms of where the city is going to expand, how it should expand, what the flexibility is. There's always more that you can do with the smaller city. But at the same time, smaller cities have less resources, technical resources, financial resources, human resources. So this is an area in which donors and international organizations and NGOs can have an impact. This is just to illustrate what I'm saying about the fact that most urban growth occurs and it does not occur in megacities, but in smaller cities. The large orange bar that you see on the right of each of these graphs going from 1975 to 2015. In every case, smaller cities of fewer than 500,000 people continue to dominate. They still, for the projected future in 2015, they still have over 50% of the total population. And the megacities are the smaller blue on the left-hand side of each of these, on each part of this graph. And at the present time, 52% of urban residents live in cities of 500,000 or more, and only 9% live in megacities. So that's another thing that we have to bring down to earth. Thirdly, urban growth comes mainly from migration to cities. Actually, most urban growth comes from natural increase, the difference of births over deaths. There are exceptions. This is not, for instance, not the case in Vietnam and China because of very special circumstances. China had very strong fertility control policies and still has for a long period, and simultaneously with policies aimed at preventing people from going to urban areas. And so the combination of these two things over a long period of time, plus the fact that in more recent years China has basically discovered cities and discovered that really this is where they have greater possibility for economic growth and for competing in the international market, and therefore this has promoted an enormous movement of people to cities. So this is an exception to the rule. But worldwide, about 2/3 of all growth comes from, or more, from natural increase. And it's a basic arithmetical fact that as a country urbanizes, natural increase predominates more and more. Why? Because on the one hand, rural areas, as urbanization increases, rural areas have less people, so there's less potential migrants. And at the same time, you have a bigger base in the cities in which people are reproducing, even though they're reproducing at lower fertility levels. So a basic lesson is if you're attending reproductive health needs, if you're concerned with the rate of urban growth, is a much more effective way of buying time to cope with it. Rural to urban migration can and should be stopped. The fact is that policymakers are increasingly set against urbanization and urban growth. There's a statistic that the Population Division of the UN every year puts out, and it shows that over about a 10-year period, the number of countries that have policies against urban growth has gone up from, I don't remember exactly, but I'd say 55% to 73%. So that there's, as urbanization increases and as urban growth levels rise, policymakers are increasingly set against it. But in fact, only draconian controls ever work, and only for a very short time. Most of the countries that have tried to prevent rural to urban migration have not been successful. And also this kind of effort to prevent, either whether through bureaucratic limitations, whether through controls on migration, or whether through eviction, all of this is against what some of the people who worked on the task force on urban slums from the MGDs called the right to the city. The right to the city being the right to take advantage of what the city has to offer. So preventing migration actually increases poverty both in rural and urban areas. It's important to consider these two things, urban and rural development, as only one concept. It's not because we're promoting urban growth that we are against rural growth, or vice versa. Successful migration to cities promotes rural development because remittances are sent forth back to rural areas, and also because cities, prosperous cities, generate demand for agricultural products in cities. So these two things work together. Fifth misconception: the poor are a small marginal minority. This appears very simple-minded, but actually I had never seen this clear affirmation. Well, look, the poor are actually a majority. And the fact is that cities really are set up for middle class, upper class, and for the productive processes. So the poor almost universally fall through the cracks. They occupy the worst possible areas in the city because there is no provision for them. They tend to be seen as something of an eyesore out there that hopefully will disappear, but they don't. In developing countries, actually, the poor are very often a majority in city growth. And poverty is now increasing faster in cities than in rural areas. And 1 billion people already live in slums. And housing conditions, we insist on this to a great extent. Housing conditions determine much of human misery. Sixth misconception: cities occupy a huge amount of land area. In fact, cities usually are built on rich agricultural land, in the center of rich agricultural land, or they tend to be in places where there is rich biodiversity, such as coastal areas. Nevertheless, half of the world's population lives on 2.8% of the Earth's land area. And 2.8% is a very liberal estimate. It's probably a lot less than that. But using nightlight satellite pictures, the figure that's come up at Columbia University is 2.8%. Nevertheless, there is a concern here that urban land is growing faster than people. The density of urban areas is decreasing as transportation improves and as the automobile it becomes utilized more and more. So urban sprawl and peri-urbanization could quickly double or triple urban land use. And so we need to have a proactive stance to reduce this decreasing density and to reduce the negative impacts of urban expansion. Finally, urbanization is bad for the environment. Actually, I love to see the quote in the World Watch State of the World report by Christopher Flavin saying that the battle to save remaining ecosystems will actually be waged in urban jungles. And this was repeated this morning at the launch. The protection of biodiversity, of natural ecosystems, eventually requires reducing rural density. Rural areas, agricultural activities either promote the expel people from rural areas, or else they generate more demand for land when they are on small family-owned farms. So biodiversity and protection requires urban density. I'm sorry, there's a mistake there. It depends on reducing rural density. Okay, I'm okay. There's a serious negative impact to cities that everybody is in agreement with, but I think that the whole literature on the ecological footprint of cities tends to concentrate on the locations in which these problems of production and consumption occur, whereas they're really a problem of our civilization. If you took these same people and had us produce and consume the way we do in the cities out in the rural areas, the damage would be a lot worse. So So it's not really a problem of density, it's a problem of a pattern of civilization. However, where and how cities do grow makes a huge difference environmentally, and some of the especially critical issues that we mentioned are land use, the relationship between local and global environmental issues, heat island effects, water and energy sources, global warming, low elevation coastal zones, and flooding and so on. There's a particularly interesting example of how urban growth in China is going on mostly in areas that are subject to flooding with climate change. So misconceptions such as these lead to bad policies. It led to futile attempts to prevent urban growth by migration controls, by bureaucratic restrictions, by evictions, and all this leads to lack of planning for inevitable growth. Policymakers seem to be bent on the idea that things are so bad that cities can't continue to grow. And while they're saying this, the population of the city doubles again. It also leads to bad policies with respect to the situation of the poor. The poor are marginalized. The cities are planned for a minority. And better off groups often capture the benefits of programs that were devised for the poor. And poverty, poor health, and degradation result from poor policies. We see that having a secure shelter, having an address, having a place where you can put your stuff is absolutely essential in terms of benefiting from what the city has to offer. And right now, universally, the urban poor are ending up in the worst possible places. These are unhealthy, dangerous living environments. They lack access to water, to sanitation, to other services. Poor people pay a lot more for basic services that you and I also use. They pay more for a piece of land, for a square foot of land. They pay more for water. They pay more for transportation. So these are unhealthy, dangerous, and unsocial living environments. And this makes the potential urban advantages, this prevents the potential urban advantage from being fulfilled. The advantages that we were talking about in terms of social participation, empowerment of women, better access to service. All of this it fails to be fulfilled because of, again, poor information and poor policies. So what to do about this? Promote an attitude change in policymakers. So first of all, you have to accept inevitable urban growth. This tendency that I was talking about earlier of policymakers universally, to the extent that cities grow, tend to turn against the cities. This has to change. Urban growth is inevitable, and you need a longer-term vision to plan ahead for both the social and sustainable use of urban space. You need a proactive attitude to foresee inevitable urban growth. You need to foresee the spatial needs of the poor. You need to project sustainable cities. And ultimately, you have to influence how cities grow. Planning ahead, just in conclusion, there are basically two things that are really worth re-emphasizing. That shelter is the most critical aspect of poor people's insertion into cities, and that the poor are the most affected by unregulated land markets. This might appear counterintuitive. You might think that poor people, since they buy land from speculators and in informal markets, that they can get it cheaper, and in the worst places, that they can get a better deal. But the opposite is true. I'm absolutely convinced. Regulated land markets are essential, amongst other things, for poor people to have access to land. A major proactive need is to ensure what we call minimally serviced and secure land. This has been attempted in several countries on a partial basis, but has never had the political clout and the consistency and the continuity over time to have the effect that is needed. And it requires a radical change in attitude and also in policy. But actually dealing with spontaneous slum growth after the fact is much more costly. If you think of trying to provide services in a slum such as Kibera, which is probably the largest slum in Africa, you'd have to think of putting a road through there so that you can put in water pipes, sanitation, so that you can provide people with electricity, transportation, just even a bicycle path. Anything that you do is going to rip up a lot of homes that have been built in which people have invested years and years of their resources and their time. So planning ahead is much cheaper, it's better socially and environmentally than letting things happen and trying to correct it after the fact. So that's a major concern and major policy recommendation. And finally, with respect to sustainability, there has to be a proactive stance with respect to the use of urban space. Favor sustainable designs, and not necessarily compact cities, but density, mass transport, minimize the invasion of valuable lands, plan ahead for urban morphology of the resources and the waste. And I think a small detail but extremely critical one is that you can't let planning in the hands of very local entities without some sort of coordination with other municipalities, counties, or administrative entities that are affected by such things as water, resources, energy, transport, anything else. And finally, a little bit of a plug for our field. We feel that demographic tools and data, GIS instruments, satellite-based data can be critical instruments in terms of the advocacy, providing evidence-based arguments for change in policy making in that attitude. Thank you very much.
Go ahead. Can you switch the
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Gib, for the invitation to be here as sort of a sideshow to the launch and George's presentation today. I have to admit, as Jeff sort of described me as being a bit of a multidisciplinarian, how was it described again? Know something about a lot of things and be an expert in nothing. It served me fairly well, though, and has brought me to my current position, which, as Urban Health Advisor in USAID, I am supported, just in salary, by two bureaus, the Global Health Bureau, as well as the Economic Growth, Agriculture and Trade Bureau. And the common interest there is to improve and expand USAID programming among the urban poor. And particularly for me, that mission is health programming. Because of the recognized importance of good health on economic growth, certainly there's buy-in from economic growth on my mission, but also the important interaction that I have with my health colleagues is what's sort of brought me here today. Gib gave me a somewhat broad scope for a 10-minute presentation, so I'm going to try to do my best to quickly get through that, but also take the liberty of putting a USAID spin on what you described more as a bit of a broader sort of global expert view of things. But since we pay some of your bills here, I guess I can do that. So first, the overview. What Gib described as what are the challenges or what are the impacts of urbanization on population health. Familiar story to some. Looking at the challenges in terms of how USAID has been trying to define those challenges through its data collection efforts, some country efforts to deal with these challenges, and what we're looking for into the future. So the impacts of health. I think the report highlighted in George in his presentation talked about environmental concerns and how environmental health concerns among urban populations are heightened as opposed to in rural areas. Simply the density of housing, which is advantageous in some ways, does create more opportunities for infectious disease through environmental vectors. So that's everything from diarrheal disease, waterborne diseases, to vector-borne diseases like malaria and dengue. The reality of that is that given the understanding that there is this large poor population in cities suffering from unique environmental challenges, that in fact their health in many countries is worse than their rural counterparts. If you looked at the same welfare measure or categorization of those people. And this is a representation of some of that sort of data for India, which has been around for some time now, but doesn't really exist for a lot of countries. Where if you're comparing, again, the same quintiles of poverty between urban and rural, in fact, the measures in rural areas for the poor are worse. So these rural, urban poor residents are not taking advantages of what cities can offer them for a variety of reasons. The source of this sort of data for USAID, the one that the mechanism that we support, is what's called the demographic health surveys. I think many of you would be familiar with this. It's used by many organizations around the world to program health activities and describe the health status of various populations. There was some recent work that our team supported, along with others, to look at DHS data and explore a few questions. What was the overlap between what's defined as urban poverty and slum residents? Because slum residents is often the sort of filter that people are looking at the urban poor through. And looking through that filter, what would be the implications on targeting of urban health interventions? What we found looking at 7 different countries is that, this is too much to read, but the message here is that what slum means to anyone is very different. The definition has now been somewhat standardized by UN Habitat, just recently, in the last couple of years, actually. But urban itself is difficult enough for various countries to define in the same way, much less come up with a slum definition that really allows you to compare between city to city what does living in a slum mean. The end result of that, if you look at some of the comparisons of welfare measures, which is a much more standardizable measure versus slum residents, is that it varies a lot between city to city. Here are 2 welfare distributions for the slum and non-slum residents of 2 cities, showing some of this variation. What you would expect if slums are defining the urban poor is something more akin to the Nairobi situation, where there's a much larger proportion of poor people in slums. In Lima, the way they've defined slums at least, which is a sort of peri-urban versus inner-urban population differentiation, basically there are just as many rich people and poor people in slums as out of slums. So if you're targeting towards the urban poor in Lima using their slum definition, you're probably missing the mark. In Nairobi, as I said, it's a better differentiation of those populations. But even there are plenty of rich people in Nairobi slums. Not plenty, but there are some. And there are poor people living outside of what's described as slums as well. So what did we conclude from this analysis? Well, between the countries and even within the countries, various slums were highly variable in their character. Within Nairobi, for example, different slums have different severities of problems. And slums and poverty are not the same, as I mentioned. There are wealthy people in slums and poor in non-slum areas. And particularly as a city like Nairobi, there are people that are lacking water services and other services that are non-poor as well. So the recommendations for this is to continue on with what the DHS survey is going to be doing, is coming up reporting on welfare as their major differentiation of populations rather than using some sort of slum definition in their reporting work. But I think a recognition that we have to deal with urban poor groupings, which again is basically what people would call slums in many situations, in program design, especially if you're talking about program design that involves locating facilities to deal with health problems. Another recent piece of research that USAID funded was some survey work done in both India and Manila, which the main focus was some qualitative research talking to both slum residents and providers, healthcare providers. And what we found looking at those perspectives of those two groups is that there's a common understanding that cash barriers are a major barrier to service. Doctors know that the poor can't pay, and that's why they're reluctant to come in for care, and the poor recognize that they don't go to particular places because they don't have the money to pay. But there are some differing perspectives, though, in terms of how what's perceived as social disorganization in many slums is, as perceived particularly by those outside the slums, the healthcare providers and so forth, is maybe somewhat of a myth, particularly in places like Asia where these slum communities are very old. There is quite a bit of organization. There is a burgeoning community-based organization movement in many of these places that can be tapped and used. At the same time, there's a communication breakdown between providers and healthcare seekers. The poor feel that they're not listened to, that their concerns aren't those of the healthcare providers that are there, and providers complain about the poor not even be able to follow simple instructions. I mean, how can I deal with these people if they can't follow my instructions on how to take medicines? So with the programming implications from this study, is feel that there needs to be more of an emphasis on alternative health financing schemes, addressing this unique element of the urban healthcare situation, which is that urban cities deal with money. Rural areas you can get by without a lot of cash, and you can have many creative programming approaches that don't deal with sort of a cash-based economy. This is really not an option and shouldn't be in urban areas where many people are involved in a cash economy. There needs to be a focus on bridging these gaps in communication between patients and providers, and improving health education so that urban residents, slum residents can take full advantage of the facilities that do exist in urban areas. Some programs where these sorts of ideas are being pursued fairly strongly, most notably is in India, where they've had carved out part of their maternal and child health program to be defined as an urban health program for several years now. The emphasis there is to working from all the way from the national level, the federal level in India, all the way down to state and local levels, to help the flow of resources, which are many resources available in India from the national level, to start addressing in a comprehensive way a much ignored urban poor population in India. And also demonstrating this through some on-the-ground interaction with NGO implementers as well as municipal health authorities. A recent success in India that there is this recognition finally at the national level that they do need to focus specifically on addressing needs of the urban poor. And they've set up what once before was sort of a sub-note in their rural health mission, a full new urban health mission, which is going to mean vast amounts of more additional resources available to cities to start dealing with urban poor health problems. In Bangladesh, there was some interesting work along the lines of the demographic remote sensing GIS sort of work to help define the challenges a bit more, done supported by our mission there. Working with the University of North Carolina, they used remote sensing data to map slums throughout Dhaka and several other cities in Bangladesh to start getting a handle on where are the urban poor. And an interesting sort of result, and it's shown in this map here, is these shaded areas are identified slums. There are a lot. There are a lot of little pockets. And there certainly are some large ameliorations of urban poor in large slum areas. But I think is typical of many cities, especially in the subcontinent. Many cities have many small pockets of urban poor. And targeting these populations through a focused sort of geographic effort is going to be difficult because they are so spread out. I'm off to Ghana next week to work with the mission there with some people from CARE and the Urban Institute. Started this interaction with the mission there, started off with a mission that I went on several months ago to address concern over the stagnation in child mortality data in Ghana. In the last several DHS data, there's been sort of a plateau in the improvements in child survival in Ghana. What I did through just simple differentiation of the data, though, was to show them that, in fact, the dotted lines here, which is the rural populations, there has been continued improvements, continued gains in rural areas, and the real stagnation has been in the urban populations. One simple explanation for that is that almost no one is working with the urban poor in Ghana in improving health care access. There have been major efforts over the past few years to expand coverage to isolated rural areas. And what we're going to talk to them about in Ghana is their efforts to pilot what they call CHIPS, their Community-Based Health Planning and Service Initiative, which is their attempts to roll out and get health care closer to people. And it was designed around, again, the rural challenges of distance. You can call them motorcycle nurses. They're standard packages, getting low-trained nurses out to rural areas hosted by the villages with motorcycles so that they can get access. A motorcycle nurse in a city is probably not the best way to approach working in a slum. So how can this initiative be changed and adapted to the urban context is what our challenge is to help them think through. To conclude, talking about the future, if any of you know anything about USAID in the last year or so, you'd think that this was maybe a quote that just came out recently. There's been a lot of institutional change and reorganization going on in U.S. foreign assistance. This is actually from about a little over 10 years ago. So the same challenges really hold true today. And my strategy moving forward is to continue to work to identify and improve the our health characterization of the health needs of the urban poor, the sort of DHS improvements, fostering our urban champions in Asia and places like India, and work more aggressively in some of the missions in Africa, where, again, much of the focus of people's programming and their perspective is very rural focused, because that's where all the poor people are in many people's view. And we need to try to change that a bit. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you both very, very much. You gave us a lot to work with. George's 7 misconceptions certainly provide a lot of material. And Tony, I think some of your examples of, again, in some ways, looking into those misconceptions and using the data to show some of these patterns really make it clear why there are some gains to be made. And in part, you have to differentiate even to understand what's going on. That Ghana slide was very powerful. Why don't we turn it open now to the audience for some questions. If you could let us know who you are and use a microphone that one of my colleagues will bring to you so that your questions are captured for the folks online as well. So if we can start in the back.
Carlos Indacochea from the George Washington University. It seems to me that when you're talking about assistance in health, you're talking about health care and even primary health care. Precisely when we're talking about urban growth in the urban marginal, I have the feeling that we should be looking at determinants. Tap water, sewage, disposal of waste, and that would go a farther way.
Okay, why don't we, if we have capture a couple questions and then give folks a chance to respond, or should we just go directly? Tony, do you want to respond first to that one?
Well, I agree. Again, part of my multidisciplinary background, I started out as an engineer. Water sanitation engineering is my concern and interest strongly. And unfortunately, you have to deal with complex institutional settings when you talk about cities. It's not the health department's responsibility to build sewers and provide water. That's somebody else's job. So you need a very coordinated and multidisciplinary approach to deal with health issues comprehensively. And even within development agencies, that's difficult because there are different people that have counterparts. You know, Global Health Bureau does not typically work with water utilities. So if you're talking about urban water, that's a bit of a challenge for them if they're going to get involved in that. They really should have a coordinated approach. But at the same time, you also have to deal with the immediate results of the lack of these services as well. So you can't completely ignore investments in improving access to health care, because there are other health concerns unrelated to environmental health problems that poor people in cities continue to struggle with, like reproductive health challenges. And the urban poor have higher levels of fertility and don't have as much coverage of contraceptives, et cetera. And those are problems that have to be dealt with through, probably best through the public health infrastructure.
Yeah. George, are there, from there are obviously multiple vantage points, but in terms of grappling with this, the kind of various different stovepiping of different offices, whether it's Ministry of Health and Ministry of Water and Infrastructure and the folks responsible for urban infrastructure in particular, are there, in the process of identifying these misconceptions, are there suggestions that you have both from the practical standpoint of the UNFPA perspective and working with fellow UN agencies, but also that comes out of the research that went into this? Because you've been doing this practically on the ground as well in Latin America and Central America as well.
Thank you. I think that I would like his next to last slide, or the last slide, where he was quoting from somebody from 1995, which I really like, because I think that has to do with the vision that we are trying to promote. That is to say, it's cooperation amongst agencies, whether international or local, but also within a longer term perspective. Looking beyond the uncertainty of budget, staffing, and organization, think about development challenges of the future. And one of the things that strikes me most is that we are always trying to catch up to the deficit on any level, whereas in reality, what we see now as problems are just the very tip of an iceberg that is growing very fast. That iceberg is not melting; it's growing, and it will make an enormous difference. So, whether you think of international agencies or whether you think of local administrative entities, really the catch is to get people involved and interested in a longer range development perspective. That is to say, see the problem in general and see how it is growing by itself, and how much of a dent you are making in that problem by the actions that you're pursuing now. So this is really the biggest challenge, because we are set up, whether at the national, international level, or local level, we are set up for the short term. For my mandate, it's like the next 4 years. That's I think, a huge inconvenience of democracy. All of the longer range problems require a longer range perspective, and I think all of our approaches to development in the recent past, have shuffled longer range views and longer range planning onto some sort of a back burner, if it even exists. So I'm not trying to resurrect the technocracy of central governments, but I am saying that strategic planning and vision for the future is really critical at any level, and within the issue of urbanization. I mean, we really have to learn to look at this growing iceberg.
Yes.
I'm Ronald Carlson, the head of USAID's Urban Programs team. I'd like to just touch upon sort of a reality check, and that is, in the development community, very few donors are focusing on this urban challenge. It's there, and it's irreversible. And there's very few governments around the world that have made sort of the political decision to challenge and address this problem. One of them is Brazil. They've created a ministry of cities that's focusing on all these problems. The same thing, India, South Africa, or a couple other countries are really beginning to focus on this. And what is needed, I think, is sort of new champions. And I see a lot of young people here today. And I'd like to throw out sort of a challenge to many of you to get engaged in this theme, because this is going to be a major problem of the future. Today there's 1 billion slum dwellers, and the world community says that it's going to try to improve the lives of 100 million slum dwellers by 2020. That's 10% of the problem. But in 20 years, there are going to be 2 billion slum dwellers. So we're only going to be addressing 5% of the problem. We're going backwards. We're not going forward. So we need more advocates, more young people to get engaged in this theme. And it's got to be a cross-sectoral approach. There's too much stovepiping to address the problem, because it's city management, it's financing, it's health, it's a whole array of issues. And we need more people advocating for it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob. Can I ask a question of you folks in terms of, because you've identified that there are these misconceptions and ones that are often held by governments and folks in terms of determining the approach. Let me put on for a second the hat that we have here that we often throw into the mix at the Wilson Center, which is the security frame. And the security community has paid attention to this urbanization trend, often viewing it through a threat matrix and trying to understand what it means and whether it is in fact a threat or not, trying to understand what it means practically for them, but also a couple steps back in terms of whether migration to urban areas is a force for stability or instability in a country, say. My limited understanding of some of the adverse government, what seem to be adverse government policies that favor the urban versus rural, such as subsidies in food and keeping prices really low, subsidy in fuel. I mean, we saw the Iranian government raise the price of fuel with 2 hours' notice, and now all hell breaks loose in Tehran. This notion of, in part, with the notion that the urban is where the threat comes to the stability of a regime. So you have to keep those prices low and screw the farmers with cheap food prices. So my question is, if that security lens sees cities as threatening, why is there not more attention by central governments to do something to address the challenges for the urban poor, or for providing some of these services that presumably are part of what keeps the city stable and them not coming out in the streets to try to overthrow the government? So why the difficulty to get people to focus on it in a productive way rather than just a threat-based way? Although obviously threat-based way is the kind of, unfortunately, the way we see too many things, and it stops there and doesn't go the extra step of trying to deal with it.
I don't know if I really want to go there. I mean, it's if you're asking me from the U.S. government perspective, I'm not sure I could
an
answer
idle
that.
afternoon over coffee impression of what that would be, not for attributing to the U.S. government perspective.
I don't necessarily. I question that premise a bit.
Okay.
I mean, I would agree that urbanization certainly speeds up the process. At the same time, there's an amount of control that revolves around the expansion of infrastructure and governance, which historically I think has been a large counterinsurgency approach, which cities satisfy in a respect. I mean, you have police everywhere to control crowds in cities, where things can sort of spiral out of control in rural areas in some situations. And I think politically, in the political power is concentrated in cities, and so, I mean, it's all part of the game. So I think internally in a country, I don't think there's necessarily a major security concern about urbanization in some respects. I think because it is more dynamic and more difficult to predict, I would think if you're a U.S. military planner, that certainly would be of great interest to you and something that you want to keep your pulse, keeping the pulse of frequently. What you'd actually do about it, I think, is a little bit less clear, and I think that's sort of where we are. I don't think we're getting any sort of major direction of, or push in U.S. government foreign assistance and urbanization, because I don't think there's a feeling that there's a well thought out strategy about how to deal with it at this point. Or it's a concern, but the answer of what you do about it, I don't think is
So
there.
in that sense, also from the government's perspectives themselves, not the kind of U.S. military perspective, but the governments themselves, which seem to be what you're saying is that we're not having enough people paying attention to that in the government, that they're then not concerned so much because they do feel they're close at hand, we can keep them closer under control, so we don't have to do as much investment.
But I think, as George said, the future, the unpredictability of this large expansion, which is predicted soon, I don't think is really understood by anyone. So it's probably difficult for them to anticipate what it's going to mean. And that's just my view. I mean,
Sorry, some other people want to talk, but I can't resist, first of all, thanking Ronald for that comment, because that really is very much at the root of my concern and my value system and my work over the last year, trying to really generate some interest, because I think this is really the critical development issue of the coming decades. I cannot see why people don't understand it. I know the truth. That's what you feel like sometimes. But actually, there are some good signs. Actually, the World Bank has finally engineered an urban development program, which had some very good stuff, which we were able to use, really critical in terms of, for instance, what does sprawl mean, the increasing density, and also trying to promote this idea that you have to plan ahead, and so they actually have practical experiences that they're trying to implement in the field and so on. So there's some very good research that's been done there. And there's also, I think it's some coincidence that both World Watch and UNFPA this year did their State of the World report on urban growth. It was encouraging to me to see a 20-page spread in The Economist a couple of months ago on urban areas, and many of the same findings came out of this. So I think I'm hopeful that we're moving on this finally, because I cannot see how it can go unperceived. Perhaps it's because people don't really see where it's going, but perhaps also it's a question of really basic values that people still have ingrained, whether or not they've been living in the cities for the last 40 years. I mean, if you go to a developing country, you see most policymakers dead set against urban growth, but they wouldn't leave the urban areas themselves. But other people should stay out there where they're happy. I mean, I'm good here in the city, but this is bad. Urbanization is bad. So I think there are deeply ingrained sort of rural folklore values that are also impacting even in developing countries. And I've had a lot of media questions these last few days, and I've been impressed at how much this still holds. That people are, what do you really mean? I mean, gosh, all your statistics are bad, and you're hopeful about urban growth. I mean, where do you get off? As for security, I'm not sure about international or terrorist kinds of securities, but there's obviously an issue here that is connected to what we were talking about, which is violence and crime, criminal behavior. In a sense, Latin America is a laboratory for the kinds of things that shouldn't be done with respect to urban planning that now we need to learn from and apply in Asia and Africa. There was a recent study by the IDB, Inter-American Development Bank, that showed that Latin America, if it didn't have the problems of violence and criminality, of insecurity, would have a GNP 25% higher than what it has now. I mean, so you can discuss it could be 20, could be 50, whatever, but it certainly is a huge factor, and I am convinced that part of the problem has been with the resistance to urban growth and to urbanization that came from the part of policymakers. When I was doing my PhD dissertation, there was a governor of the then state of Guanabara, in now Rio de Janeiro, who put blockades on the road. And then the mayor of Sao Paulo later did the same thing. And I think this it never was effective, but it reflects a mentality that was pretty well generalized. And just recently, I've been reading about stuff in Argentina and Brazil, about people saying, well, really, we have to find ways of keeping people down on the farm and making generating rural development, not realizing rural development actually expels more people. So I think that this ingrained mentality, which led us to not deal effectively in a proactive manner with urban growth, with very rapid urban growth, is one of the roots of the violence and security, because it's largely based, and it is a result of very blatant inequality, a result of poverty and the misery that you see in the cities, and the reality of the inequality that you see every day, and the misery of some people, and the conditions of other people, and the way that they are treated. I think all of this is background and culture for generation of violence. I'm not talking about terrorist threats. I'm talking about violence, and I think we can repeat this experience.
Vic?
Vic Barriera, George Washington University. Thank you again for George for an excellent presentation, and Tony, thanks a lot. We're sitting here in a city of 550,000 that's the capital of the free world, yet it has some of the highest rates of gun violence. It's facing problems with heart disease and diabetes that are off the charts relative to the rest of America. It's dealing with Southeast by gentrifying and displacing many people out of their homes. And the trends are just as clear here as they are in Delhi, Lagos, Indore, places like that. I think to get to what Jeff was saying, one of the problems, and it's a fundamental problem, that the ones that are suffering are the poor. And this city has one of the greatest disparities in terms of wealth of any city in the world, probably. And unfortunately, as we know, Latin America teaches us, Carlos teaches us, that as wealth increases, the disparity between rich and poor increases as well. And to me, this is one of the fundamental issues that we have to deal with in the urban environment in terms of caring and in terms of service. But to me, it's so difficult because here in Washington, D.C., we can't even deal with it yet in terms of health services, in terms of nutrition, in terms of chronic disease epidemiology, in terms of housing and general services. And the opportunities are definitely there, but it seems so difficult. And I'm wondering if there are any other examples that we could share to see how we can get at some of this based on this pro-rich policies that we see in a lot of urban areas, and not as much pro-poor policies that we see in places like Mexico, et cetera. Thank you.
Any magic bullets? Certainly a good reminder for us to worry about our credibility about speaking in other parts of the world when we're not doing it here, and so some modesty and remember that this is a phenomenon that's not just an over there issue that we have paying attention to.
Yeah, I don't want to take up any more of your time, especially since I don't know the answer. So I'll let somebody else go ahead.
Oh, just one note of optimism on that. As George pointed out, the majority of growth is in smaller cities, unlike Washington. And although the challenges of municipal authorities in these cities, which many of them were just little podunk towns before, without much municipalness to them at all, is great, because they're completely new challenges that are falling upon very nascent institutions. I think some of these barriers may be easier to overcome because they require political commitment and a sort of integrated sense of community sort of writ large over a city, which I think you may have some hope of cobbling together in some of these smaller towns, which tend to be quite integrated with their rural surroundings and have a bit of an identity that I think can help support that sort of comprehensive inclusion that's required for programs to be successful in bringing in the poor. I think the big cities are always going to be a problem around the world because they're full of a lot of strangers. You know, people in New York don't talk to each other on the subway, but you go to a medium-sized town in just about anywhere in the world, and people will talk on public transportation on the little bus that's going around. It's different, and I think one of my targets is to try to focus a little bit away from the megacities in some of our programming to start developing these models in the sense of commitment to coverage for all in these really struggling smaller towns, which are going to see a lot of growth and be very challenged. So they need our help. But I think at the same time there's some optimism for success in some of those places.
Great. There were two questions here. Why don't we get those and then give you guys a final chance, and then we'll have to close.
Hi, I'm Julie Locasio, a consultant, and you've tried to pull together a lot of huge themes. I'm wondering if you could try to add in a couple more that I haven't heard you talk about, which is projections about bird flu, how that will affect public health worldwide. And I recently heard an estimate that there will be 1 billion climate change refugees, and what's going to happen with that, given that when you were talking about governments and the limitations of democratic governments and always working on short time frames, and they can't seem to do anything with a long time frame unless there's an enormous fear factor involved. Are bird flu and climate change refugees going to play a big impact, have a big impact in demographic changes and how governments deal with urban planning?
And if you could hand that just back across the table. So avian influenza and those kind of big shocks and what that might mean, as well as the climate. Yeah.
I'm Maggie Mullane. I'm with the Osgood Center for International Studies. Our professor from George Washington kind of took part of my question, so it's kind of boring. But I'm from Austin, Texas, and I realized that especially in Texas and in southern communities, there's a lot of like urban sprawl, and so I'm study like urban economics. I'm really against urban sprawl. I think it's horrible. But anyways, my point is a lot of that and the poor being in a certain area is due to past institutions and laws. Basically, it's all based on the infrastructure, and like the poor people can't get out of their sectors even though the city continues to sprawl around them. And I was just wondering if, I did a project on it about Austin. I know it's true for Austin. Is that true for other countries in the world that are experiencing the same thing? Is it due to infrastructure and they can't break out of that, or just any recommendations on how to deal with that, I guess?
Yeah. Some of the biases for transportation systems and what that means for the patterns of urbanization. There are a couple there for us to end on. If the two of you want to make any final comments on that or any of the aspects of the discussion, then we'll close at 5.
Okay. Well, I think the report has much of a chapter dedicated to climate change and some of the implications for that vis-a-vis urbanization. But it's both of these problems deal with. I think what we're concerned with, sort of on our end of the business, adaptation. There are many preventative things that can be done, but it's, what happens when these effects start to occur? How do you adapt? And I think the bottom line is that the poor adapt poorly and the rich have money to adapt. And if you have, and this has basically been demonstrated or shown with avian flu, for example. The projections on what would happen for a worldwide outbreak are that well, a few of us would die in the rich countries, and there would be devastating losses in developing countries. It's because of the infrastructure that's available, the access to care, the systems that can respond, et cetera. So, I mean, the same could be said within a city as well. Those people that are excluded, those people that are living in floodplains, in the lowest lying areas of a city, where many slums are today, when sea levels begin to rise slightly, they're going to be affected immediately, as opposed to those who live in better housing situations. And they'll have fewer resources to be able to adapt, to move, et cetera. So, I mean, the bottom line is always the same, and the poor are the losers. And so, all the more reason, though, to have forward-looking strategies that try to address these issues on a comprehensive basis for a city as a whole, and start to realign allocation of resources to ensure that everyone benefits from the resources the vast resources that are available in cities. I mean, I'm not sure exactly what you mean on the movement of people, et cetera. I mean, slum redevelopment, which is a large theme and the major focus of urban programming and development organizations for a long time, has dealt with this major challenge, and it's the same in U.S. Urban policy of what do you do with people that are living in terrible conditions and sometimes these very nice real estate in inside cities, but happen to be underserved in very dense housing situations. And there's two strategies, basically. You build high-rises for them or some sort of denser housing which is of good quality, or you get them out of there into somewhere else where there is good infrastructure and better housing. Both of those strategies are fraught with failures and difficulties in implementation. And I think pretty much we have the same challenges, we've had the same challenges in the U.S. as many developing countries face in finessing these things. I think the main lesson from all of that work, though, is that it can't be a top-down approach. That really doesn't work. And that community-generated, or at least community participation in coming up with sort of brokered solutions is the key. You have to have city-level involvement, because that's what infrastructure involves, is centrally planned and located works. But you have to come up with solutions that people will accept and live with, and come up with a political solution, basically, where everyone is involved. And I think that's the bottom line on your question, from my view.
Very quickly, I'll start with this last point. I think that Anthony's absolutely right. The need for participation, actually, we haven't had a chance to focus here on one of the issues that we try to emphasize a lot in the report, which is that the people who are doing actually probably the most in terms of improving local communities worldwide are organizations of the urban poor, and that is to say the people who live in the communities and who evolve from very local concerns into broader concerns and deal with most of the problems. This is an issue that I've been grappling with all along. On the one hand, this efficacy of the OUPs, the Organization of the Urban Poor, definitely is. These are actors that you need to deal with when you're talking about how to deal with natural disasters, climate change, or even the design for the city of the future. At the same time, there is, I think, a kind of a spatial, temporal limitation in terms of the interest of these interest groups. And I think that this is, I'd like to say this is our niche in a certain way, in terms of providing different alternatives that people can discuss and review, but evidence-based possibilities that are really founded on a different level of information. I'm not going to say better of information, but on a different level of information. And that really have thought through these different issues. For instance, the issue of transport and the organization of the city and sprawl and so on. There's been a lot of discussion in the literature recently about sprawl versus compact, etc. And in a sense, I've come to the conclusion that the discussion is a little bit misplaced. In the end, if you have a city, multi-nucleated city that is spread out over a rather large space, but which is transport efficient and energy efficient, then I think that there really is nothing wrong with it. And in the same way, if you have green areas in a city that generate biodiversity, again, I don't think that you can say that necessarily a compact city is better. So I think it has to be environmentally friendly rather than necessarily compact. But one of the things that we do know is that suburban growth and asphalt growth is really detrimental. And on this very profound thought, I will be a start.
Okay. Terrific. Well, there was a lot of profound thought in today's meeting, and I appreciate very much the time that you both have taken to join us and for your really fascinating presentations. Thank you to the audience for good questions. I was remiss in not thanking Micheline Kennedy from PUSH for helping us today. Really critical, I know, in working with George and UNFPA on the report and providing the opportunity for all of us to discuss it. And there are copies of the report on the table, so I urge that you pick that up. We will have the video and write-up and, with permission, the PowerPoint slides on our website here at the Wilson Center. So we urge you, as you tell folks about this meeting and want to refer back to it and take advantage of these resources and come back and join us here at the center. So please join me in thanking our guests.